Morning, everyone. Welcome. I'm Gary Goldberg. I'm the Chief Data Officer at BP's Integrated Supply and Trading Unit. And today, I want to offer you a challenge. I want to challenge how we currently think about much of what we do with data, whether you're a CDO, CAO, or in any of those organizations. I want to think about how we actually use data to drive profitability, but not for others. I want us to actually become profit centers in our own right. I think we stand at the precipice of a new change, and I want to talk about how. So before we start, or as we get into this, I want to be a bit interactive. I'm going to go out on a limb, and I'm going to play a bit of a game. I'm also probably going to give away my age. If anyone doesn't remember Play Your Cards Right with Bruce Forsyth, it's a very simple game. I'm going to ask, well, the game worked like this. You'd put up a card, and you would determine whether the next card was going to be higher or lower than that card. Pretty simple game. Well, welcome to Play Your Cards Right, Big Data London Edition. How much data is created every day? There's a really nice infographic from a recent Forbes article. I think it came from Domo. Talks about the amount of content created online every day. Apparently, in the time I've been speaking in my introduction, 120 million emails have been sent. And I reckon most of them are probably ending up in my inbox. So your question, if it works, higher or lower? Who thinks the amount of data created today worldwide is lower than 500 petabytes? Anyone? Higher. Good guess. Every day, according to Domo, 2.5 quintillion bytes of data is created. It's a huge amount. And if I put that into simpler terms, it's about 2.5 billion gigabytes every day. And if I was to stack it up in a visualization as a series of 1 terabyte hard drives, the pile of drives would stick up about 64 miles. It would just about be touching what we call outer space. Every day. So then when I think about, okay, it's a lot of data, what good does it do us? How much is it worth? When I ask about becoming a profit center, I want to see how we can make use of that data to generate P&L. How much is the data in the top 2,000 companies in the world worth? Anyone hazard a guess? I don't have a little card visual on this one. More or less than $1 trillion. More or less than 2 trillion. Would it surprise you to know that the value of all the data in the top 2,000 companies worldwide is $5.68 trillion? And that is a figure that grows practically exponentially because we just saw how quickly data grows every single day. And if I compare that sum to some other very large sums, and we look at the number of new shares created in the market every year. So 2017 was a pretty good year for equity issuance, but by comparison, all the companies that came to market, all the IPOs, all the new shares created in 2017 was 780 billion. The EU? Well, the EU estimates that the value of all personal data for all EU citizens by 2020, so next year, will be worth a little over 1.1 trillion. And last year, corporate debt issued globally, this is all of your corporate bonds, not government, but corporate bonds, came to a total of about 1.34 trillion. Even adding all that together, it doesn't come up to 2/3 of the 5.68 trillion. So we're sitting on data in all of our companies, because I'm assuming that most of us here are from companies that are about in the top 2,000 worldwide. We're sitting on a huge value that's completely untapped. And so I ask, I just ask because I don't understand why. Why do we struggle to get budgets for analytics when we sit on that level of value? It's a serious question. And the best I can see is that we're sitting on data that we're just not using. It's all there, it's untapped, it's potential, and it's left on the table time and time again. And part of the reason for that is I don't think it's often articulated in a way that our board will understand. Data is often talked about incrementally helping customer insight to generate profit for other departments. It's talked about as a control function. It's talked about as a risk mitigation. But why not P&L? My goal is that every CDO, and I mean every CDO, has the opportunity to become truly self-funding. Every data function has an opportunity to become a profit center. How? I know you're thinking it, how? Well, the way we've tended to look at data historically is around a very simplified model of the sort of elements that go into a data strategy. We have data analytics, management, strategy, architecture, data 101. And I call that the data foundations. And I don't dismiss the data foundations, I rely upon them. I'm currently building those out. But in a new way of thinking, when we want to become a self-funding profit center, those foundations become one component in a data strategy. And we need to start introducing new vocabulary. When you say data analytics, I say R&D. When you say data strategy, I think marketing. And when you say data architecture, distribution. A new paradigm in how we think about data as a profit center, because we are a business, and our business is in providing that data. And I do want to talk about the foundations because I do absolutely rely on them. But when we start looking at data as a profit center, as a self-funding entity, the data foundations are no longer a risk mitigation, they're no longer a control function. It's the fundamental investment that we need for our business to grow. And it changes that conversation at board. Because when I look at, for example, the Burj Khalifa, the tallest building in the world, a huge, great feat of engineering. Before they built one story of glass and glamour, they put 110,000 tons of concrete in the ground. They filled a hole 12 stories deep, full of concrete. And if they hadn't done it, I pretty much guarantee you, I would never set foot in the 110th floor in that building. That foundation and the hundreds of millions they spent on it was never questioned as a throwaway, as a waste of money. It was a mandatory investment to get their return. And so just to go back, and when we start looking at data as a profit center, why that becomes so important is because your customers, whether internal or external, don't want bad data. It's as simple as that. And at the same point, the architecture becomes the fundamental tenet of how we distribute that data. How many data architectures do you know that look something like that? And we do it time and time again, and investment is undercut, and our ability to distribute, to manage those data flows is impeded. So my model is to change all of that and to think of ourselves and move ourselves to be profit centers. I know what you're asking. What kind of profit center? What does that mean to be a profit center? Well, a lot of companies, you'll see the data function operate as internal markets, where they'll sell their services internally, and companies will, your marketing or your front office will effectively provide cash on that basis. If you're lucky, you might be able to share the profits. They might give you some credit so that you have some nominal P&L that you can represent. But it's not real P&L, it's just a virtual representation. And if you could even move that money really into your budgets, it's just moving your money from one pocket to another within the company. And if we talk about, there we go, shared savings, it's much the same. I'm talking about something different. And that something else is about changing our model to be offering data externally. Now, when the internet started, we went through the initial wave of internet revolution, and we moved then on to Web 2.0, where every individual had the opportunity to become a publisher. And we see it now. Twitter, Facebook, blogs, they've changed the way our society runs. Whether you think it's a good thing or a bad thing, different story, but it has made a huge impact. And the way, gone too far, the way in which we're able to capture value, real value, to actually monetize the 5.68 trillion that sits in our companies is by selling it externally. Because at the moment, it's the only way of generating revenue and balance sheet impact from our data. Firstly, we all sit on data or have opportunities for data that we completely miss, completely overlook. I've spoken to companies with large fleets of vehicles, whether nationally or globally. How many of them are capturing and using and monetizing the logistics information they glean from that? Very few. How many of those companies are putting dash cams in all of those vehicles and selling the AI insight? Not that they need it internally, but they have access to data and insight that's useful for other companies. Completely lost. When we're sitting in our company environments and we're looking at the data we have for our internal purposes, there's huge amounts of data. We're marginally useful for our drive for customer insight, for manufacturing improvements, also provide opportunities for external companies to acquire that data, to use that data, to license it. And we don't think about that because, one, I think we're all focused so much on looking internally, but also it's a difficult conversation. I do get that. Nobody wants to give away their corporate gold. Nobody wants to give away what's seen as proprietary information. But if I exclude what would be proprietary, if I exclude what would come under GDPR and exclude any of the personal data that you would want to retain or not worry about selling, there are still trillions of dollars of corporate data that are available and marketable if we just apply ourselves to doing it. That revenue is new revenue. It's not something that we're beholden to another function for. We're not helping marketing to sell more of the existing products. We are then selling a new product. We are producing data, we are mining data and insight, and we are monetizing and selling it. And whereas I love the idea of putting data on the balance sheet, I will happily have a beer or a coffee with anyone who wants to talk about drive to put data on the balance sheet. I am a huge fan. And when the accounting boards finally allow us to do it, it will be a great day. But until then, the only way we can get data on the balance sheet is to sell it. Because when you sell it, you generate cash. Cash, that goes on the balance sheet. And in doing that, changing that model, we change our mode of operating. We change our relationships with our companies because we can actually fund the work that we want to do. And finally, I've missed one of the other opportunities as you evolve that journey is that you can sell not just the raw data, but you can sell the analytics. You can build the analytics, build it for your own purposes and sell it out. You can also use the opportunity to test analytics, new ways of working for your external marketing, and then roll that into your internal processes. So there are multiple ways of getting budget for what you want to do. And so when I look at that, and I look at where we're going, and I think we are at that change where just like Web 2.0, we're starting to see more and more consultancies, more and more companies actually driving this value, trying to push out how we sell data. There are growing marketplaces. I'm not a fan of many of them, to be honest, but marketplaces that exist to facilitate this. So it can be done. But there are a few things I'd really like to see in the marketplace to make this a little bit better. One, standards. We have problems with standards in our own companies and our own corporate data sets. But when you look from a consumer's perspective, and there are hedge funds and insurers, et cetera, that are active in the marketplace, pulling in new data and new data insights, one of the things that makes it difficult for any consumer to pull on that data is the lack of standard. And with that, the homogenization of the data sets. So I think as an industry, as a profession, we have opportunity to not only sell our data, but to think collectively about how we would define the metadata standards, the frameworks that would allow that to happen on scale. You can do it now, and it's much more of a bespoke operation. But as that grows more and more, that momentum will naturally drive those introductions of homogeneous data sets. And then the inventory. For our internal purposes, that becomes a problem. How do you manage all the data across all of your data lakes and data warehouses? But when we start looking at that cross-industry, we are going to rely on marketplaces. We are going to rely on vendors to support that. But somehow we need to be much, much better in how those data inventories are managed. Because the marketplaces that I've seen are so infantile, really, in how they manage that. It's not good enough. And I think there are huge opportunities. And the last thing lacking in the marketplace is one about pricing transparency. It works well for you selling data now, because without transparency, you can possibly charge a bit more. But the question is, how much should a customer pay for your data? And the inverse of that, how much should you sell it for? Now, I like that last question. I want to talk a bit about it, because I've done research in this in the past. I actually have a 54-factor pricing model that I created to determine how we value that data. Now, when you can come up with a valuation model, not only can you determine how you sell the data, you can have a really intelligent conversation with your board. You can look at what the data, if we took, I guess, all the 2,000 companies that I addressed earlier and that 5.68 trillion, if you can value the data, even academically, you can start to prioritize. You can start to have intelligent conversations about what value could be released and how it could be released and to whom it could be released. And I won't go into all of the components, but I list out a series of components to any valuation model for data. And the factors that you would be looking at are the disruption to your company, to others, the materiality, of course, the number of data points and the frequency. But quality becomes a huge player in what you can charge for your data. If you can demonstrate that your data is a good collection of data, it's accurate, it's complete, it's timely, you can charge more. And so when we talked about the foundations, this is no longer an academic conversation or a conversation of risk mitigation. It's a conversation of investment and return. If I can invest $10 million in improving my data quality to realize another $100 million in sales, it's a no-brainer. Your process maturity and your data governance also become real conversations. There are hedge funds out there now that are data-driven hedge funds, and they spend a huge amount of time assessing the process maturity and data governance on anybody that's selling them data, because they want to be sure that the data they're buying, because they're not buying it as a one-off, they're buying it as a stream of data over the life of a contract. And they want to know that those companies selling that data have the wherewithal and the process to ensure the ongoing quality of that data set. The characteristics. The broader your data set, the more frequent you distribute it, whether that is going to degrade from usage, all of those become factors. And of course, the marketplace. When you look at data, if your data that you're going to sell is applicable to one narrow market, it's very specialist, and clearly the overall value of that is less. If that data can be used over and over again, if it can be used once I generate my analytics, and I can use that data in 100 different marketplaces, and those markets are liquid, and they're growing, and they're scalable, well, you've hit the jackpot, because you have data that is infinitely valuable. And all of those things go into a valuation model and how you quantify that. So we have the data. We actually have a growing marketplace. The data we have is growing every single day. We saw it, 2.5 quintillion bytes. I love that figure, every day. And we have means to value it. So on that basis, my challenge to you is to go out and profit. Any questions?